Thank you. So I'm going to be presenting some results from a recent biodiversity mapping project that was finished over the last 12 months or so. So we set out with this project to work out where localised centres of plant biodiversity were in South Australia. For that purpose, we wanted it to be a completely numerical method. We wanted to avoid, for this particular project, relying on expert opinion and asking people that knew about it. So it was completely data-based analysis. And we'd also looked at threats associated with the biodiversity centres. We were interested in these potential localised areas from a biogeographic point of view, but also as a way of looking at where in the state should you concentrate if you want to conserve the plant species that are there. So there's going to be quite a few maps of South Australia for this. So there's quite a bit of background work went into this, even though it's the results are relatively straightforward. There was development of methods, there was software development to do some of the analysis, some of the concepts, and then there's an empirical paper that came out at the end with the main results. So pretty sport here with the data we had for this. So through these data sets you can see here had access to over 700,000 individual observations of plant species. So many of them are vouched records from the herbarium, but also importantly the Biological Survey of South Australia is really a good source for this because it's systematically sampled and they set out to go into different areas and habitats and sample across those. So quite a bit of the work was done on the Biological Survey data. So just going through some of the main results. This is a map of basic species richness, so it's a number of plant species mapped through grid cells. And as you can see, for straight species richness, there's no localised centre, but basically we get a fairly predictable pattern of basically the agricultural areas in the south have relatively high species richness. The outback areas, the rangeland areas, relatively low. So that doesn't tell us anything much about particular centres, but what we can do with that is it helps us to correct some of the other metrics. A lot of the other metrics that we used are quite correlated with species richness, so we include corrections for sampling and corrections for the amount of species that are there. So if we go to some other metrics, so these maps here are showing the number of species in particular categories. So on the left we've got the number of national parks and wildlife listed species, so rare and threatened species. So there we start to see most of those are concentrated in a small number of locations, so Southern Flinders Ranges, Eyre Peninsula, Mount Lofty Ranges, Kangaroo Island. The right hand one there is showing species that have been deemed by the herbarium to be only found in South Australia at species level. So this is basically counts of species that are on a list of local endemic species. Doesn't take into account how widespread they are or anything like that, it's just whether they're considered endemic. So you can see from that that really strongly highlights these two areas. So the Lower Eyre Peninsula is a real hotspot for these things, and so is Kangaroo Island. So that's where the majority of our only found in SA species are found. So this one here is a bit of a different take on the endemism of the species in the data set. As you can see, it looks a little bit different. So this one, rather than ask which species do we know are endemic to South Australia, it's basically scoring all the species by how range restricted they are within South Australia. So if you have an area with lots of species that have narrow ranges within the state, that scores more highly, whereas obviously if the species are generally widespread across the state, it doesn't score very well. So that gives us quite a different pattern. It highlights the Mount Lofty Ranges more so, and also, as you'll see, the Eyre Peninsula drops out of that analysis. So the Lower Peninsula, despite having these high number of known South Australian endemics, doesn't rate so highly when you actually do it numerically based on the range size of those species. We also see the lower south east is highlighted there, and also the APY lands in the northwest. They come up quite strongly in this analysis. That's partly due to biases of confining the analysis to South Australia, because those corners of the state have some kind of different landscapes and habitats, which means the species there in the South Australian context are going to have a fairly restricted range within the state. But in terms of conservation of all those species in South Australia, that can be relevant. So this is another take on the endemism metrics, but this is including evolutionary history in it. So for this analysis, what we did is get the entire list of species from the South Australian flora, and these days we're able to build phylogenetic trees that link all those species based on what we know about the relationships. And what we do then is score areas not just by the number of species, but by how much evolutionary history they represent. So in technical terms, you develop a phylogenetic tree of the species in a particular grid cell, and then you count how long the branch lengths are within that tree. And then what you do is, again, similar to the endemism score before, those are down-weighted by the range restriction. So if you have a particular family or group of plants that represent a lot of diversity, but they're widespread across everywhere, it doesn't score that highly. Whereas a particular lineage, if it has a narrow range within South Australia, scores highly. This comes out relatively similar to the species-based one, partly because the ranges of the lineages are based on where the species occur that belong to those lineages. But basically we found that this one highlighted again those same areas, but a little more emphasis when you correct for species richness on the APY lands in particular, and also the southeast comes up as having some different lineages. And what we found with the phylogenetic analysis is that basically across the lower rainfall areas of the outback, there's actually lower than expected amounts of phylogenetic diversity. So in other words, a smaller subset of the families and plant lineages are actually found than you could expect at random across those areas. So based on all these metrics and a few other ones that we ran as well, we were able to identify these 6 particular hotspots or centres within South Australia. They all have different attributes associated. We've got, for example, number 1 there, Kangaroo Island, western side of Kangaroo Island, pretty much scores the highest for everything. So species richness, phylogenetic diversity, endemic species, threatened species, it's got the works. Whereas some of the others, so the Southern Flinders Ranges number 4 there, was mainly rated for listed threatened species more than narrow range species and those kinds of things. So moving on from that, having identified these localised areas that have these large concentrations of biodiversity, as I said, we looked at a few threatening processes to that at a very coarse scale. So one of the things we did there was to look at climate sensitivity. So we looked at, for the set of species that you find within a particular grid cell on the map, how sensitive is that to changes in temperature across the landscape spatially. And so we look at neighbouring grid cells and how different they are to each other and how different they are in temperature. And that gives us an idea of climate sensitivity. So basically in that map, with that modelling work, we've been able to map that out across the whole state using a combined data set with all those records that we had. And in that map, the brighter yellow areas are where there's a lot more change as the temperature changes spatially. So this is basically the most sensitive areas to changes in temperature. So potentially, given a whole range of other complications that come into it, if we have further climate change into the future, that might be one area where you expect there to be the highest sensitivity in species composition. You can see it basically forms an ecotone area, transitional area between the outback areas and the Mediterranean areas in the south. And what we found is, away from that transition zone, the rates of change are much slower in terms of temperature. There's still a lot of spatial patchiness, a lot of turnover due to other factors, but in terms of differences in climate, it's not much happening. It's mainly along that ecotone area there. This may not be much news to you. This is a map of remnant vegetation for South Australia. So it's looking at the proportion of native vegetation in a moving window across the state. So obviously we've got very high clearance rates across the agricultural zone and not much clearance at all in the northern areas. Basically from that we see that most of the centres of high plant-based biodiversity are also quite fragmented, but particularly the Mount Lofty Ranges is very highly fragmented for a hotspot. We also can see things like the eastern Mount Lofty Ranges. They have very high levels of habitat clearance, so In some regions down to as little as 5% native vegetation remaining, but it also, from this map down on the right hand side, you can see it's off the eastern side of the Mount Lofty Ranges, is being modelled as being highly sensitive to climatic changes and also high fragmentation, so that's potentially an area that's going to need some work to maintain that, whereas you've got Western Kangaroo Island, for example, relatively, compared to other areas of the state, relatively high amount of native vegetation remaining, relatively lower climate sensitivity. So maybe other issues there other than those to deal with. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. We have a couple of minutes for questions.
Greg, do you have any idea why the southern tip of York Peninsula doesn't join in with whatever's happening on Kangaroo Island or the southern tip of Eyre Peninsula?
No, I don't have a definite idea on that. I mean, a little bit of the reason is actually that there's pretty high clearance rates across there. It's only down to the tip there's really much vegetation left. But I think even given that, there's really not much endemism happening there. So whether it's because it's too small an area that species haven't been able to be sort of isolated down there and persist, I don't know. But yeah, it's something to work out, I think. At the moment, we've just got as far as where are these things living, and I think there's a lot more questions around how they got there and why they're nowhere else, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I just wonder why so positive on the western side of KI. What's the difference with things happening or not happening there that we can't keep up with in other places?
Compared to the eastern side, for example? Or?
Where it was most intense, where it's richest.
So why is that? Why do you think that scores highly? Well, obviously, for the Kangaroo Island as a whole, you've got the spatial isolation. So obviously, even though it's been joined to the mainland not that long ago, obviously quite a few things have persisted there and not persisted on the mainland. But I guess also Western KI has poorer kind of lateritic soils than the other side of it. So partly that means there's more vegetation left. So when you go out there and survey, you find more things. But perhaps also the diversity is related to topographic changes in those poorer soils. So that's all I could offer at this stage. Yeah.
I might have to cut it off there, but please